Hello and welcome back to the Robin Zander Show. I am so excited to sit down today with my dear friend Aubrey Blanche to talk about the future of work, the ever-changing nature of work, especially as impacted by the last 18 months of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the state of justice in the workplace and beyond.
Hey, I'm Aubrey Blanche, and I'm the Director of Equitable Design for Products and People at Culture Amp and the CEO at the Math Path. And I also like to yell my opinions about equity and inclusion in tech on Twitter.
Aubrey, I'm so delighted to sit down today.
I'm so excited to be in the Zander Media office for the first time.
Thank you very much. Yeah. You and I have been talking about having conversations in public since 2016.
Yeah, I think that's about right.
I think my curiosity for you to start is these conversations that we've had about the future of work, about accelerating change, about justice in the workplace. Where did that interest arise for you? Because you've been talking about it at least as long as I have. Yeah. And, we'll get into your work day to day, but where did your original interest in exploring these topics develop?
The obsession with fairness, I will say, which has sort of turned into justice and equity, that was something that was just always deeply ingrained. So my dad told this weird story at my wedding once, but he talks about how as a kid, I read something in a book and I come up to my dad and I'm just bereft and I'm telling him about it. And I'm like, Dad, well, that's just not fair. And he looks at me, being the adult, and is like, well, the world's not fair. And I just got so angry at him. And so he follows me out of the room and he's like, why are you so upset? And I said, what a lazy thing to say. I think that I've always just been really preoccupied with making sure everyone else was okay. And I think part of that comes from just being quite a marginalized kid in a lot of ways. So I'm adopted. So I'm super sensitive to people who are left out. And then I grew up as the only Latina little girl in my school.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in northern Michigan.
Okay.
And so I got very sensitive to this being othered and being left out sort of feeling, but hated it. So really didn't want anybody else to feel it. So I think that was always existing there. And then when I got into the tech industry, it was just really white and really male and really cis and really abled. And I just kept hearing what people said back to me when I was so I'm being Latina, and I sort of say it's a joke, but I'd ask people where are all the Mexicans? We're in California. And they would say, oh, well, we only hire the best, or we don't want to lower the bar. And I was like, that's a really racist thing to say, but you don't seem to know that. And so that's kind of where the two threads came together. I was sort of initially motivated to inquire why I personally was experiencing things, and then started to understand and put together and grow in my consciousness that this was a systemic problem. And so then my motivation I'm a very extrinsically motivated person. And so it went from me being I want to understand this when it's happening to me to I want to solve this because it's happening for other people.
I'm fascinated by that transition
from
I want to understand to I want to solve.
Yeah.
Because, I've spoken publicly about, the bullying and the growing up as a very sensitive boy in a very rural town that I had in my childhood. And it took me, more than 15 years to start coming back to a place of power through that.
Yeah.
Right? Which is still a path that I'm on. And I hear for you the taking the injustice that you experienced or that you witnessed as a kid and driving towards creating change. So, and even more than maybe a personal story, I know so many people personally who've been shoved down, who've been disenfranchised, who never get back up and never find ways to create impact. So do you know where that changed for you or how that transition happened?
I think there's two pieces, and it's anger and privilege are the answers. So the first example for me is I'm someone who has a very, I consider myself as someone who have a hair trigger temper. I just get very pissed off about things.
I had to, as a man, learn to find anger.
Oh.
So, men stereotypically, and in my experience, right, have anger culturally more acceptable and more readily available.
It's the only emotion they're allowed to
have. Exactly, yeah. I was the opposite.
Okay.
So growing up, anger was anathema in my family and in my culture because the men that I saw were very rural and sometimes very rude and very aggressive, and I said, I don't want that. And so it was through a lot of self-study and a lot of examination to find my own ability to express anger that then finding calm on the other side of that, but to go from victim to anger to reaching towards greater calm. So I'm super curious by anger as a as
Yeah.
a power in some way that you had?
Well, I think of anger as it's this motivating emotion, right? And the thing for me is like, I actually struggle with anger when it comes to like anger on behalf of myself. Like, it's not super accessible.
Understood.
But that's why where the shift from the systems thinking, all of a sudden I was like, oh, it's not people bullying Aubrey for being Mexican. It's society has decided that like Latinx people are less than.
How old were you when you recognized that change?
So I would say it's like an evolving thing, but like to get a little off topic, like I didn't realize that I looked white until I went to college because I lived in a very small town and I went to a very small school system where like the kids made sure that I knew that I was like different. And so to me, my ethnicity and like my cultural heritage didn't come down to skin color because like, quite frankly, like I looked like all the other kids. So going to college, people stopped being racist to me like very suddenly, right? Because people didn't know. And so that was when and this gets back to the second point about privilege, is like I learned what white privilege was. Not that I didn't have it before then,
Sure, 100%.
but that I didn't have a consciousness of it in the same way.
Of it.
And so the kind of anger and the privilege collided when I got into the workforce, because I was like, oh my God, all of these people are being shut out of all of these opportunities. And my face manages white fragility. I can talk to straight people because they don't know, I don't freak out abled people because I'm disabled, because those are aspects of my identity I can hide.
You can play on these borders.
Yeah, exactly. And then on top of it, like the skill or the training that I have is as a social scientist, so analyzing systems and moving them. And so I thought, what is the highest and best use of like the particular privileges and skills and talents that I have? And I get technology, I'm good at talking to engineers, and then I really take a systems and a data approach to these problems. And I like technology. So that kind of meant I need to do this sort of justice work within the context of tech. I never like went in being like, I'm gonna be a DEI professional. Like I was too naive to even know what that was, but I just really cared about the problem that I saw people from my community and related communities being treated poorly or talked about in dehumanizing ways, and it pissed me off. Like that's like what it comes down to, is like I got mad and then started doing math, which is probably ridiculous to some people. But I think that's what it comes down to. And what I would hope is that we all can like tap into the righteous anger that we should feel when we experience injustice, because that anger can move us to do something.
It's a signal.
Yeah.
And it's a signal to pay attention to.
Yeah, absolutely.
I also love, and it's the reason that we're building Xandr Media, and for me, for the rest of my life, for the next 70 years, I'm going to be building this company to solve a problem that I had and that I experienced, right? And that's been spoken about in the world at large plenty of times, but to go into DE&I, which we'll define momentarily, out of sort of your righteous anger, or you're seeing the problem in the world and wanting to go out and make the change, right? For me, wanting to do storytelling at scale so that we can tell stories against the climate crisis or against the next version of Robin's Cafe, whatever it is, big or small, that I and my community see needed to move forward. What is DE&I, right? To someone who maybe doesn't work in the technology world, who is working at a small, medium-sized business that doesn't have consultants who can fly in with capes to solve all of their justice problems.
Yeah. So when we say DEI, like what it stands for is diversity, equity, and inclusion. But when I think like get away from all the definitions and things, it's really just about creating equitable workplaces where people are treated fairly and with respect, regardless of their background. And so if you think about it from that frame, the important part to take in is not just the immediate context, but the historical context, the social and historical context we're in. But like when you go to that, you go, well, I could be a small business or I could be a medium business and have that. Now, the scale of the complex problem is bigger. So bigger
the more
companies,
people you
more
add,
consultants, more capes.
Hopefully.
But ideally more capes, always. That's really what I think about, is how are you building a workplace that seeks to interrupt these historical patterns of oppression or exclusion that we've had. So that could look something like, making sure that you're hiring or interviewing a broad set of candidates, that you're considering candidates with non-traditional educational and life experiences, right? It doesn't have to feel like a radical social justice project in order to be serving the process of equity. So That's what I would say for small companies. Can you make it a practice that your company requires that everyone is learning more about communities different from themselves? So a part of working at Xandr Media, and I know this because I've met some of your team, they have the luck to get to learn from different people just by virtue of working here. But even in a situation where your workforce is not yet as balanced as you would want it to be, normalize that part of the team meeting is reading a blog from a queer author, or during February, making sure that you're studying the specific, you're reading about, let's say, really great Black creators here, right, to inspire the people here. So when I think about diversity and inclusion, it's both about increasing the awareness of the people in the organization about the historical context they're swimming in, empowering them to help interrupt the historical patterns that we don't want to see anymore, and then trying to do that in a way that respects human dignity. So yes, in my consulting practice, I'm helping clients think through how do they design a complex performance management system and audit that system to make sure there isn't discrimination. But diversity and inclusion is equally showing up and showing care for someone when their community is impacted by trauma. And that's a conversation, that's not a program. So I think that's what it is what is it? It's, in the way I think about it, is it needs to be the most accessible next step to creating more equity. And you actually just need to focus on that. So be aware of the big historical context, but take the next immediate action for equity in front of you. And that's really what doing DEI is all about.
I love the focus on the next step being have a conversation with people, right? So when I think about, for me, company culture or companies I've advised, right, having the founder, the CEO, whoever holds authority, have more one-on-one conversations with their team, right? And I have heard so many times the pushback of, oh, I don't have time, or I'm too busy selling, or I'm too busy raising money if it's a venture-backed company. And just, right, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, but the actual one-on-one of who is this person? And then the layer that you're just adding that I for sure have struggled with as a straight passing white man in America, right, is having some of those conversations, having some of those dialogues around the specific topics of where are the potentials for injustice? Where are the potentials for, right? I haven't asked the team to go out and read, blog posts by queer authors. Right? And so how do we incorporate that? And the answer that I hear you giving to me at Xandr Media is, right, is the one-on-one conversations and the invitation to learn more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it also, something to be careful of, especially in a small office, is especially if you're trying to push for education or awareness on an identity and it's one that one of your teammates shares.
I shouldn't be the one to teach about that identity.
And maybe you should compensate that person for teaching about it, or in other ways, reward the contribution. Now, maybe that's if everyone's contributing from their own identity, it's equal labor. But you have to always balance that we should be listening to people with lived experience. And then also we need to make sure we're pushing self-education.
So many images of sugar plums of putting together a program at Xandr Media of what are neuroatypicalities that team members hold that we could speak to, right? I for sure could speak to bullying, right? Right? What does it mean to be a person of color, right? On the team or in California today, right? That's something that I would love to sit and talk with my team and learn from my team about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's speak to the value of, so thank you.
Yeah.
And let's speak to the value of the why of this. So I run a creative shop, right? And the more tapped into contemporary culture that we are, the more our work is going to be reflective of, right? I mean, ultimately creating art that serves commerce, right? Because we're a for-profit media company designing media and advertising media against the end goals of our clients, right? But to do brilliant creative work, we have to be tapped in. And so, and to be tapped in, we have to be representative of cultures that we are speaking to, because otherwise the media is not going to land, right? If, I've only recently spent more and more time getting to know TikTok, and unless I'm actually part of that ecosystem, trying to create TikTok videos is irrelevant, right? It's actually detrimental. And so I understand being representative of the cultures we're trying to create or trying to represent or trying to speak to. I also know it's really difficult, right? Or it can be really difficult. So what are some other reasons for folks listening or for me at Xander Media to that DE&I, that justice at work actually serves the end goal of the business.
I'll talk about a little bit about like the business case, which I just think is like really insufficient. Quite frankly, it's like it's a really bad investment case, and I'll talk about that. But I think like what it ultimately comes down to is like, and I will also say I don't think that you're convinced by the business case, because I think you do the things for like the right reasons.
Because
and I think you have to.
like working with, because I'm actually ultimately allergic to walking into an environment, an office or otherwise, and working with unhappy people. Actually, for me, it is a fundamental moral imperative that if I'm going to be working, right, I'm not able to work in a context where people are miserable, because I feel it, I'm impacted by it, and I would rather just leave.
Right. Well, and I think what you're speaking to is exactly what I would want to talk about, which is there's lots of research that shows that more diverse or more equitable or more inclusive, it's all of those, environments, people are happier, they're more engaged. Now, there's some downsides. So there's like higher perceived conflict with people, but that makes sense because there's greater difference of opinion. People are just, they do better in environments in which they're with people who are different from themselves. And that's true in a lot of contexts, but when we're speaking to the work context, I think one of the reasons for me that's so powerful, so we've talked about the business case, which is this just really at a basic level, that increased diversity of identity and experience in the workplace leads to greater innovation, problem solving, financial performance, all those things. The problem is that the cadence of business and the cadence of justice work are like fundamentally misaligned. So, and this gets back to some of the points we've talked about off camera about like the lack of resourcing for this work in many cases, is because like a business cadence is on a, 2-weekly or a monthly or a quarterly cadence.
Or if it's a publicly traded company, right? I've learned this in the media landscape, but I knew it before through, Responsive Conference and Responsive Org, sort of my ecosystem around the future of work. When a company is responsible for quarterly reports to the general public, to shareholders, then it has to maintain profitability. It can't take risks. It can't go and experiment. It can't go try out a DE&I initiative that may or may not be good short term, but we know is going to be good long term, because shareholders are going to say, can't do that.
Right,
because
absolutely.
It literally has to respond to the next quarter's numbers.
And also, I think there's the side swipe, so where companies like are both making these like big historical commitments, right? But then they're not actually following them with the resourcing that's aligned to the level of commitment that they've made. And so, and you see that that's exacerbated by the business cycle. And so that's why I always tell people, like, can I swear?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. I'm like, fuck the business case. Because it's not good enough. Like, because at the end of the day, there's always going to be a business reason to not care about it. And so you will stop at some point. And so what I always tell people is like, what kind of world do you want to live in? Because, I mean, we're cooking, so we're running out of time. So let's hurry up on this problem. But I think that's a part of it is, do you want to live in a world in which white men, straight white cis men, are irrationally hoarding power and ultimately not being innovative and breaking some stuff because they don't know how to speak to everyone, because no one knows how to speak to everyone? Or do you want to live in a world where lots of different types of creators are creating things that serve the needs of an increasingly diverse global society where we can all solve problems together? Like, which of those visions are you inspired by? And then what actions do you need to do your part to help us get there? So like, I am amenable to the business case. I teach it to executives. I always say that leaders that are not convinced should just be on performance plans. Like, it's 2021, right? That's what performance improvement plans are for, is like, great, you're lacking in a core competency for your role. Great, we can educate you and we can support you in growing that competency. Anyway, I just enjoy calling like a lack of ability to consider inclusion an incompetence. And I think that's important that we shift that, because it's so easy for this work. And this goes back to the business cycle of, if we're just focused on business, like, this isn't a fundamentally business concept. And so it will get sidelined if we're not doing it, because it's how we want our business to exist.
Is it not, right? Because old HR is all about compliance and payroll, right? And new HR is actually, it is so obvious that when people are unhappy, the business suffers, and that when the people who work within the business care and are fulfilled, the business thrives. Like, that is so evident. That's a very clear business case, whether a CEO recognizes it or not. And so in some ways, I actually hear you saying the same thing.
I think that's absolutely true. Like, I think this is good for business, but if your sole orientation or justification is just grounded in business performance, you're going to run out of steam before you're done, right? Because this has to be grounded in wanting to see the world differently. And then the way that I think about it is a business is a way to bring that change into the world. So we should be all actualizing change because we want to live in a society where people are treated well and with dignity and et cetera, et cetera. But we can choose that if our domain is business, that our business furthers that objective. And I think that that's a deeper level of reasoning. And then you can go tell your investors or your VCs or whatever that like, oh, look at the business case is great.
Business, yeah.
Right. But like we're purpose driven, but we also understand. And I mean, we talk about this at Culture Amp a lot is, like the mission of Culture Amp, the company, is to amplify the experience of 100 billion people at work. But like a thing that is implicit in that, but like my boss, the CEO, and I talk about a lot is like, it doesn't work if we only do that for certain people. Like one, it's harder to get to the number, full stop. But even outside of that, it would suck if we amplified the experience of 100 million straight, white, cisgender, able-bodied men only at work. Right. We have now widened historical inequities instead of closed them. And so every company should be able to tell their own story about how they connect that broader social mission to their business operations. But if you start with business operations, I just don't know that you get there.
Totally. Let's talk about Culture Amp. I've sat down with Didier, the CEO of Culture Amp, the CEO and co-founder, for a podcast interview years and years ago. And he and I met in person for the first time in maybe 2015, right as I was getting started building Responsive Org and Responsive Conference. And then also Steve Hopkins, who was an early employee at Culture Amp and a dear friend, was one of the original co-founders behind Responsive Org, this ecosystem that I now run. So familiar with the business, but maybe for folks listening, like what is Culture Amp? And particularly, what is the role that you sort of have built for yourself there?
Yeah, so Culture Amp is an HR technology company, and we build an employee experience platform. So we help employers listen to their employees. So that's through feedback surveys, through continuous feedback and listening, and then also help them drive sort of processes that help improve the culture. So that's everything from performance reviews and management all the way to templates for more emotionally intelligent and psychologically safe one-on-ones, to sort of what we call skills coach, which is sort of micro-learning for managers. So on things like coaching, resilience, strategy, inclusive management, things like that. So what I do at Culture Amp is a little funny. I literally just had to write my job description yesterday. Someone in HR was like, we're supposed to have job descriptions on file for everyone. You have to fill it out. I was like, oh goodness. So when I came into Culture Amp about a year and a half ago, I was originally scoped to take on a scope of work that the previous head of diversity and inclusion had taken on. So I was really owning the HR strategy and especially cultural transformation as it related to DEI.
Internal to the company.
Internal. And that was sort of the full scope of the job. But in my interview, I came to Didier and I was like, I have all these product ideas. I love your product. Can you please hire me so that I can come in and do this? And he was like, okay, you're at a 10. I need you at a 4. He didn't say that, but I think he felt it. But basically, he brought me in to do HR and said, I'd be really happy to talk about your longer term ideas. And so over the course of the last year, as I've grown my team to sort of make sure that we're still pushing forward that agenda on the internal transformation, I've started to help the business think about how are we tracking the DEI business. So of our customers that we're supporting, what percentage of them are actually coming to us for DEI related support? What are the services that they need on top of that? What are product features that might help amplify their work and push them forward? So now my role is a little bit of a hybrid, and it's the title is a little bit silly. It's the director of equitable design for product and people. So my role is both looking after and working in collaboration with a lot of leaders to set the product strategy in terms of how it supports DEI leaders, as well as leading the internal transformation of Culture Amp. So in our DEI program and much of our product work really works from an intersectional perspective. So our big focuses within our program are anti-racism and disability and access. And we believe that by focusing on those two communities, we ultimately create a workplace that's better for everyone. But because those two identities and experiences tend to face the most stigma and barriers, that by going hard on those things, we end up creating a good space for other people. And we see that in our data. So we have a pretty gender balanced company. We're, fully representative of the population from a queer LGBTQ perspective. And so anyway, that's our work. So I look after product, people, but everything having to do with sort of the equitable transformation of Culture Amp.
How do you, as Aubrey, look out into the world, listen to what the world is doing, especially in, we can talk about the last 18 months and the COVID pandemic, but like, how do you attend to what the world is doing and how the world is changing and then build accordingly?
Yeah, so I think part of it is I follow the dialogue on social media and in the media. So what are companies actually talking about and reporting on is first. And that's sort of the first layer, which is what is the story everyone wants you to know, which is not the story, but it is a story. Yeah. And looking from that, using my experience, having been in these roles, in these leadership roles, I know how the politics works. I know how the internal works. So I'm able to sort of hypothesize about the gap between the real story and sort of the presented shiny story. But then I also spend a lot of time talking to other sort of DEI leaders or folks who are adjacent to this space. So I think it's really helpful to also talk to business leaders, to CHROs. And a lot of it is I'm like, just tell me your pain points. Like, what do you not have? And the number one obvious thing, as everyone says, is resources. There just aren't nearly enough resources.
Meaning time and
money,
capital.
time, headcount, all of it. Because it's what Culture Amp's research, so that's the other thing, is we do original research to tell us about this market. But our research is telling us that, the majority of our customers who have formal DEI roles are one-off roles. So there's a one-person team and they're not in leadership. And so, we understand that. So think from the empathic point of, I call her Angelica. She's my persona that I designed for.
What's her name?
Angelica.
Okay.
And she's the person I design for when I'm thinking about products, actually. So she's a mid-level woman of color who probably has a lot of really great experience in marketing or program management, but has been sort of tasked with taking on the DEI programs at her company. Totally. And I'm partially basing that on myself and my particular career, but also the careers of a lot of people I mentor and that I know. And so I spend a lot of time talking to those people, imagining, and looking at also the data that we collect. And what I have found more than anything is that people in these roles need resources and they need more data. So they need resources just to do things, but they need data to be able to make sure that those resources are allocated to the places where they can do the most good. Also help justify the resources spent. That's an 100%. Important part of it. But resources and data are the number two things that I see people in my role or similar roles needing that they don't always have access to. And that's why I like being at Culture Amp. I'm someone who has to work at a mission-aligned organization, or I'm the worst employee ever. And so for Culture Amp, I feel like I'm actually doing something useful against that problem at a scale that's really satisfying. I don't think scale is always important. I think single acts of equity and justice matter too.
But you can look at the total number of people who are impacted by your action, and there's satisfaction to that.
Yeah, and that is fulfilling to me, and that's why I feel really grateful to be in the role that I'm in.
Changing gears a little bit, you've been so public about things in your personal life that most people in the world, and especially in the world of work, shy away from. I have struggled with that personally and see it everywhere, where I'll have conversations with people I care for who have new diagnoses, who have big breakups, who have cycles of abuse. And I've seen you speak to aspects of your life professionally that are flabbergasting. Where does maybe if there's any of those stories you want to share, but where does the courage or whatever it is, the chutzpah to share those stories publicly, where does that come from?
I was going to joke and be like, my Mars is in Aries. No, but that's kind of a joke. But Gryffindor rising. But that was a very millennial thing. All the Gen Zs are going to think I'm very uncool. But no, I think where it comes from is it goes back to this righteous anger that I have. So I usually don't get pissed off on my own behalf. But when I see, especially when we talk about disability, for example, it is so stigmatized to be a disabled person across, not even to get into things that are beyond stigma. And again, going back to this idea of privilege, it's always been really important for me to sit back and think what can I do to be useful to my community? And So I'm bipolar type 1, so neurodivergent, mentally disabled, have a couple of other mental disabilities as well. And my thought is, well, if I'm like a tech executive who's white passing, who's sort of straight passing, who's definitely abled passing, if I can't speak about my disability, who the hell else is going to?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so for me, just earlier this year, I had a pretty severe manic episode and had to be hospitalized, which is just like, if you broke your leg, no one would think anything of it. And
100%.
so when I got out of the hospital, I made the decision to like tell my entire HR team what had happened, because I like disappeared from work quite quickly. People were very confused. It was very disruptive
Absolutely.
to their work for that to happen. And so I made the decision that had two sort of, I think, impacts. One, I had some disabled teammates who were like, wow, I've never had a senior leader be like, I have this major disability and it just effed up my work life. I'm sorry, to me. And now I feel like if that happens to me, I'm going to be fine.
I have more ability to share it.
But I think it also just, even for people for whom disability is not their point of marginalization, it says like, oh, leaders don't have to be perfect. And I think as leaders, that's one of the most important things that we can do, is show people our flaws and our bad decisions. Because I think about, for every success I've had, there's at least 50 that like things I've done wrong that like aren't on my resume that you didn't see. And so I think that's a part of it. I also just, I've had a lot of trauma happen to me in my life. So in addition to being disabled, I've also been in domestically violent relationships and things. And I think when we talk about the future of work and the world of work, it's no longer a world in which people's personal lives and professional lives are completely separate concepts. We no longer are asking people to bifurcate themselves. And so I think a part of that is being able to take your experiences into the workplace once you've processed them, to be able to destigmatize and show people that space. But one thing that's really an important part of me sharing is I want to be really careful that I'm not asking for like emotional labor and trauma treatment.
Right, you are not sharing to unload or to burden somebody else, or asking me or whomever on the internet to solve this problem for you.
Right.
You're actually having done the work of looking at yourself and understanding pieces, then coming and saying, this is what happened.
And it's really important for me to say, like, I don't want to make any like moral judgments for someone. Like, some people could do their work and then decide that being public about it is like the totally wrong thing for their journey. That's also super legit. But I think that for people who have the capacity and the interest, the more that we can share our stories, I think that just the easier it becomes for other people to not necessarily walk in our footsteps, because I don't think anyone wants to be me. That would be weird, but can at least illuminate a path that might be available to them.
Super cool. What is the math path?
Oh, the math path. So it is this portmanteau of a word that I worked with a team to come up with, and I was the solution that the math path, or the problem that the math path solves, is I was trying to figure out a way to explain to people that I'm like an intuitive empath and a giant math nerd at the same time. Like, I think about the regression analysis that describes intersectional privilege, like on Saturday mornings. And so I was working with a team and they were just like, oh my God, math nerd plus empath. It's a math path. And so for me, it's what I named my business because it resonated with me so well. But what it gave me was this way to say, I want to take a very math and science approach to these concepts that are often misunderstood, to lack rigor. And the reason that felt like such a correct placement for me is because, as we talked earlier about, all of my liminal identities. So like the thing I'm really good at is being a translator between people with two different sets of experiences, because in many cases I've had both. And so the math path is like my kind of cheeky way to try to get at this idea of like, I'm translating between these scientific concepts and these sort of more community, relational, human oriented concepts.
And what does the business do, right? Speaking one small business owner to another.
Yes. So I like to, I call my business an equitable design firm. So I do speaking, leadership development, consulting, all around the concept of equity. So that covers everything from sort of businesses. So do they want to do, like I've worked with a client recently to look at a selection process for a board of directors and identify the ways that that process was either equitable or inequitable. Or, have done audits for a full DEI strategy with clients, or partner with companies to design new learning sort of experiences, whether that's VR. And then the last bit is I work with companies to think about the equity of the outcomes of their products. So especially if they're working in the disability in the diversity space, are the ways that they're using technology actually aligned to the principles that they say they're advancing. So it can be anything in that bucket, but really what I consider myself an expert in, myself and the team that I work with, is really having to do with anything around equity and fairness within a process or a program. We can help people think through that at a deeper level.
And how does it work having the full-time job of designing equitable products and, places for people at Culture Amp with also running this business that is the Math Path?
Yeah, so I mean, part of it is that I have a team. Like, people are like, oh, how are you running the Math Path? I'm like, Lawanda's running the Math Path. No, so Lawanda is my business manager and a really incredible member of the Math Path team. But I think that's what it is we also need to specialize in order to do more. And I think what that points us to is how do we find the value in each member of the community that's coming together. So I can only sort of juggle both jobs, one, because my boss lets me, thank you Didier, but also because I've set up systems around me that look to that. So I've got, the Math Path team that manages the business. So I show up and do the consulting, and they have their really important points of that. But also at Culture Amp, so much of my job is an influence-based job. So it's not always like creating a document. It's like having 4 coaching conversations and then enabling those people to go out into the world and create change. So I think how do I juggle it? I have an EA. I'm very rigorous with my calendar. I have very hard boundaries on my time. But what it comes down to is really believing in and trusting the people around me, that they know what they're doing and that they understand where we're all trying to go together, and just at some point just let go. And say it's either not going to work, which is my fault for having not set up an appropriate system or enabled people correctly, or it is going to work, and that's because people showed up.
What's it been like this last 18 months for you personally and professionally, given the world of work and how work has changed because of the COVID-19 pandemic, given that you're in a space around justice and diversity that has, in the public's eye, grown hugely since the murder of George Floyd and the movement for Black Lives, but then also personally as somebody who has had lots of different struggles and different sort of obstacles to overcome that, some of which you've talked about already.
Yeah, so I would say that it has been one of the most raucous 18-month periods that I've ever been through. So I'd say professionally, it's been really trying to work in what is, to be a white-founded, majority white organization, in the middle of trying to evolve as an anti-racist organization and being very intentional in that, and sort of being stared at by 400 people as okay, we want to do this, Aubrey, what are our, what are our marching orders? Sorry for the tangent, but how do you define for Culture Amp or for yourself an anti-racist organization? So the way I think about it is I really go back to, Ibram Kendi's definition, which is the outcome of something racist or anti-racist, and therefore that's how we decide. And binary. So, binary, right? It either resulted in an anti-racist outcome or didn't. There's certainly neutral things that just don't have racial content occasionally, but most stuff does. So when I think about evolving as a more anti-racist organization, and I think it's really important, I always tell our leaders, we never say we are an anti-racist organization. That's not a promise that we can hold up, because that is continuously measured by the ongoing processes that we're creating. But what we can say is that we want to evolve as a more anti-racist company, so that is every program, is every department, are the actions that we're taking as a business, are they getting to us to a more anti-racist place than we were previously? So and this goes back to I talk about equitable design, not diversity. It's because I really want to focus on the process of doing the next thing. Because it's so easy to get caught up in oh my God, this is structural oppression, these are 10-year goals. But I'm don't focus on that. Just focus on doing the next right thing. One of my mentors is Professor B.J. Fogg at Stanford, who published Tiny Habits as a book. Also Persuasive Technology. Yeah, was originally the Captology Lab, which is the Persuasive Technology Lab. A bunch of very interesting, influential people in the world came out of his lab, but he's very understated. And he gave a TED Talk, for example, on if you want to learn to floss one tooth, right? And that's actually how small to start. You floss one tooth and you celebrate the bejesus out of it. And if you want to do more on a given day, fantastic. But actually the mark of success is to start so small and then grow it from there, right? And so for you to say,
what is the next step for this organization to become more anti-racist makes a ton of sense to me.
And like the next step is not putting out a Black Lives Matter statement on your website.
Right, or a black square on Instagram.
A black square on Instagram. And like, let me be clear, I'm not going to drag the people who put a black square on Instagram just because I have the defense budget when I want to drag stuff. But I think that there's this idea that the next smallest thing, don't make it the showiest thing. So we talk about this in social justice circles. We would talk about this as performative things versus not. But I think like the next smallest thing is like allocate a budget, collect data, right? Like look at the next thing.
Have one conversation with one person.
Have one conversation with one person. Take an interest in, and now I'm speaking to like white male leaders, but like it's like take an interest in the career aspirations of one of the women of color that's within 3 levels of you.
Yeah.
Go invest in her career and open a door for her.
Why within 3 levels? Like why not, as the CEO, right, talk to the intern?
So I think that would be good. I just think that often the path to leadership within a few levels of the CEO is much murkier. And so like that's where people get stuck. Whereas like going from like intern to like, I'm using engineers, but like intern to like junior engineer, there's usually a reasonably well laid out path for like, if you do these things, you will get this next thing.
I love it. It's the structures of power that are not discussed
or like
explicit.
There's no roadmap.
Yeah.
Right, like how to get, and I mean, this is a conversation I'm in the middle of, but I'm like, how do I get from director to VP? And even though I have like really satisfying conversations about that, it's still like, here's the 6 factors that will go into that, which was not the same thing when I was going from a junior program manager to a program manager. And so I think that's why when I say to the CEO, I say to C-levels, find someone who's likely not in a rut because of themselves, but they're more likely to face structural barriers that you specifically can move out of the way. Because for that intern, there's lots of managers that could do that on their behalf. 100%. And so this goes back to do the next right thing, but do the thing that it is your highest and best purpose. At Culture Amp, that's like with Didier, his job is to do a bi-weekly check-in on all of the leadership hiring from a diversity perspective. I could do that, but he wants to keep everyone accountable.
Cool.
And do you know how much fire it puts under people when it's the CEO as opposed to the head of diversity? Whereas the coaching conversations about how to actualize that, that's my highest and best purpose. And so together, we're taking unique roles that are ultimately pointed at that same goal, which is equity, representation, sort of inclusion.
It's neat to hear that described because one of my takeaways from the conversation with Didier was the first time I'd heard of diversity debt. Talking about being a company founded by 4 white men. Yeah. There's a lot in the world talked about different types of coding debt, right? Like if a product is designed poorly and then a team needs to come back and revisit it later, right? But actually there's culture debt too. There's, right? Like we've been living in a toxic culture as a company for a long period of time, are trying to revitalize that. But actually the path to revitalizing that is going to be huge. Speaking abstractly, hopefully not true of Xandr Media, right? Or Culture Amp. But this idea, right, of diversity debt is something that I know Didier was thinking about in 2016. And to hear the concrete, right, not a lot of CEOs will take the humility of actually having those biweekly calls, right, and those biweekly meetings.
Yeah, but I think, so to speak of something that like I think Culture Amp, I don't want to say they got wrong, but I also don't want to say they got right, because I think it's an overstatement, so Didier definitely is a leader who has much more nuanced thoughts and is much more educated on these topics than I think the average leader in his position. But one of the things that Culture Amp got wrong at the beginning was they didn't focus on anti-racism as a first priority within their DEI strategy. And what you see is that it has meant that their gains in DEI, which have been significant, have been mostly in like the white feminism vein. So for example, we do actually have really great representation of women leaders, of women across the business, but that the majority of those gains, not all of them, but the majority of them have accrued to white women. And that's something, right, with our focus on anti-racism, with the increased hiring of BIPOC folks that we've done over the last 2 years, we're correcting that. We are paying down the diversity debt. To use that phrase, which was coined actually by Andrea Barica, who is a queer woman of color, who is a former coach at 500 Startups. Anyway, she's a good personal friend, so I happen to know that. But the point being that like we are paying down that diversity debt, whereas companies that start by focusing on anti-racism often actually have an easier time in the long term paying down that debt, because racism and then disability to some degree are some of the most intractable issues that we see in organizations. Many of the shifts that we make to support a more anti-racist organization end up also accruing benefits to, say, people from marginalized genders
Oh, it
or
made
marginalized sexualities
so much sense to me when you laid out those two as sort of primary pillars for your endeavors.
So, and that's what you'll see is when Culture Amp began their program, which was actually a really well-run DEI program, it primarily focused on gender and queer issues. And so we saw that the benefits of that tended to accrue to those communities. But when we design from a disabled perspective or from a BIPOC perspective, we get a twofer, whereas we don't necessarily get a twofer if we design from the other direction. And so I think that's where Didier and I would both be in agreement based on our conversations that like we still have diversity debt to pay down, and that's something we're really dedicated to. But that goes back to we're doing the next right thing.
Totally, 100%. We were talking a little bit about your experience personally and professionally from the last 18 months.
Yeah, so I would say it's been, in speaking to other diversity professionals, this has been the most difficult sort of run in our professional lives. And I think one of the reasons, outside of the increased sort of pressure that's been placed on us as a spotlight, because these are both internal and external roles for the most part. I've even known folks at like more consumer-oriented companies, like their companies had to hire security for them because the discussion around diversity has gotten so heated. So there's like the personal toll that doing this job has had on professionals. But then I also think there is just the escalating scale of trauma that people are experiencing. So we went from a place where we're really focusing on like, are we getting equitable promotions, to like what percent, like an actual conversation I had over last year is like, what percentage of my Black and Indigenous employees have had a first-degree family member die in the last 6 months? And the number is like in the medium double digits. And so that scale of community trauma that we're seeing because of COVID, which is impacting everyone, but disproportionately those already marginalized communities, it's almost been like, do everything you can and recognize that there's a certain amount of things that like D&I professionals can't take on to solve because some things are outside our organizational context. And so I think it's required us to have better boundary skills, to be more strategic about the resources we do have and who we're deploying them on behalf of. I think it has required more sort of self-care and boundary setting than I've ever had to in my life. And that's also because I was having my own like mental health crisis amid all of that. So I think that's it. It's been harder for DEI professionals, not to mention so many other people. There's a level of overwhelm that people feel at the scale of the problem that I don't have any brilliant solutions for, except everybody do the next right thing and like we will get through this together. And then I think there's also been this, we're in a very interesting period where companies made all of their anti-racism commitments, you know, post the video going viral of George Floyd's murder. And we saw these commitments, but like what we haven't seen is the progress that's come from that. And I want to be thoughtful that like the amount of progress that's possible in a given year isn't necessarily like going from 5 to 30%, you know, senior leaders from particular groups, but we should have seen more than we have. And so I also see a period of rising frustration and intolerance of the weight from marginalized communities that I think is a really fair amount of frustration. And I don't have a solution for that either, but that's kind of the ecosystem that those of us in this work are doing, which is we are trying to mind the practicalities of doing this in like a business and, for my peers, high growth tech context, with the realities that there is justice that people are seeking that they should be entitled to.
Take next action, right? Take the next step. Embrace righteous anger, right? Or use that as a power, as a source. What other advice would you give me as a professional to, you know, the owner of a media agency thinking about building for the next 50 years?
I would say question all of your inputs. So like your inputs to your life are your family, your friends, the people you work with, but also like the feeds that you follow or however you get media and news. And I think that our society is so aggressively segregated that without intentional effort, it's impossible to get viewpoints that are different from yours. And so I think I have a lot of people who say like, oh, I don't have, and this comes up because I'm teaching an anti-racist management course right now. People say like, I don't have any Black friends. And,
right, that's actually my responsibility.
And I'm like, well, but you also have to think like maybe a Black person doesn't want to be friends with you. Like, it's possible. I don't know.
100%.
So, like, rather than like going and seeking to be a friend with a person of color because you want to solve your social, like, start with like making sure that you read the root, right? Make sure that, you know, for you, the creatives that you follow are minimum X% Black, are, you know, X% creatives of color, are queer creatives, are disabled creatives, so that you make sure that you're building a perspective on the world that is reflective of lots of different perspectives, even if you're not necessarily getting that difference of perspective in every area of your life. In aggregate, you should be. And so start with one domain and diversify that. And then go back to that, the first point you made, which is like, do it again. Just keep doing it. But yeah, diversify your inputs.
Thank you.
Yeah.
For folks listening and watching, where can they go to learn more?
Learn more. So definitely aubreyblanche.com is where I live on the internet. And if people want to tune into my like digital soapbox where I give all my unsolicited opinions, that's at ADBlanche with an E on the end on Twitter.
Great. Aubrey, this is such a joy. I'm so glad after so long to actually sit down for an in-person conversation. Thank you for taking this time.
Thank you so much for having me.